So here I want to share my vision for what DAO governance is going to look like and how it's going to be able to unlock the full Web3 vision of having web scale, verifiable, and permissionless services. And I also want to contrast how we're executing on that vision to, for example, how Polkadot works today, which I would say is arguably the at the frontier of where DAO governance currently is. So let's start with where I think we are today. So we see a lot of different problems with DAOs that are live at the moment. One of them is that we have very low liveness. So DAOs typically make very slow progress at changing the protocol or the community in some substantive way. Many people construe this as being the low participation problem, but it's actually a bit different. It is correct that having more participation would allow more proposals typically to pass, which will allow a system to evolve quicker. But really what you're aiming for is not to have a lot of people participate all the time. What you're aiming for is to have a system evolve quickly and in align with the interests of the token holders. And overall, I would say that we're failing at that. You could take a lot of systems as reference points. One would be maybe Decred. I think Tezos also hasn't really gone at the speed that maybe people would have hoped. So that's a major problem. The other issue is the pervasive use of non-binding governance processes. So I think Snapshot in the Ethereum community is a great example where you do something off-chain and then you have this intermediary like a team or something that has to mediate that to an actual chain. So I think that's a big problem where obviously Polkadot has really unlocked the extent to which teams can tackle that, in particular in the upgrade functionality, but also in general with having higher throughput chains, they have really put a dent in that problem. Another really big problem, I think, is that we are generally working with very simple domains. We have people tweaking one or two, financial parameters, which are very important, but it comes nowhere near the level of complexity that you would be looking at to coordinate, a very large set of diverse actors that you would typically find in a sort of Web3 service. And the last problem I would say we have is a lot of deliberation, which is perishable, as I would call it. So for example, in the Polkadot ecosystem, you see basically there's a trusted service like Polka Assembly or something similar where all the discussion happens, which is really detached and far less verifiable than everything that happens within the system. And I think that's also a big problem to having these systems work effectively, certainly over long periods of time. So let's look at some of the solutions there. One very big improvement that's going to help with the liveness is to have blockchains that understand the different proposals that you can execute and what they mean. So you look at something like Polkadot, that is generally not the case. If you look at the democracy module, for example, that you'll see most Polkadot-related projects, including Polkadot itself, rely on, it basically doesn't know what the different extrinsics that you can invoke through a proposal are, and therefore you're stuck with having one uniform sort of threshold level of safety for how many people have to show up and how many people have to vote in favor of something for it to happen. And that basically relegates you to having to have the most severe sort of threshold for every conceivable action, and that's very ineffective. So you could think of something like spending $10 and upgrading your runtime. Those are two very different types of operations, and in order to have a system that has high liveness or moves forward quickly in the correct way, you generally want to have differentiated levels of sort of quorum and threshold requirements, and that requires the system to fundamentally understand what the different proposals that are being invoked are. So I think that's going to be very commonplace, and that's certainly what we're doing. On-chain execution is exactly this part I talked about of not using these off-chain tools that are mediated by trusted third parties. That's going to be key. Another key is having more hierarchical organization. So most systems, I would say, you see in the DAO space have one person, one vote on voting on proposals, and that's it. And those proposals can do something. That's generally not a very effective way to process propositions about how to change the system. not only because of this issue that I described where there's one threshold level for every possible thing and then you need to have a very high threshold, but fundamentally different participants in a governance process have very different human capital, different availability, different skill sets. So not everyone is going to be equally qualified at actually understanding the nuances of each proposition. So therefore, you're going to see much more hierarchical structures where you have specialists be involved in having the privilege to execute certain lower risk actions that are need to be faster paced in the same sense that you would find in sort of like more like a corporate entity, for example. So that's going to be more commonplace, and we've moved in that direction with Joystream. And then lastly, I think a lot of the discussion and deliberation that's key to every proposal that you see is going to move to be on-chain as well. I think that's really important because that data fundamentally has to be a part of the system for the long term, and fundamentally you have to trust that whoever is saying what is claimed to be said is actually the appropriate actor on-chain. And I think this is something that is going to be more severe over the long term, where really the way you understand the skills and reliability and significance of a community member is by looking back in history and understanding how they've participated, and having that data be part of the history of the chain itself, I think is going to be key in allowing that. So we've started to work on all of these. We can look at some early data that we have, which is very promising. So this is from our Sumer network. This is our 9th blockchain, which is implementing basically not the final version of our governance system, but basically it implements the main features of what I talked about. And here you see, for example, the past, I guess this is 7 councils. You see a very high frequency of proposals going through. And what's important to look at here is that, these are test nets where there's very little at stake, right? So there's, in a sense, there's smaller reason to care and show up and look at all these things and discuss them and figure out what's happening, but we still see people doing that at really astounding rates. These councils are week long, right? So these groups of, I think these are 16 people on these councils are processing, dozens of proposals per week effectively. And these proposals are, they're actually a very diverse set of proposals that mean very different things that you have to understand in order to actually successfully distinguish bad from good proposals. And you can see here the list we have of 11 proposals, I think, if I'm not counting correctly. That has to do with this introspection. So we have an enumerated list of actual proposals with different thresholds and quorum requirements. And still we're able to see, a lot of throughput. And we're going to see even more of this complexity when we go to our Olympia network. We're going to go to 24 proposals. That's soon to be rolled out, and we believe that by mainnet we're going to have upwards of 50 proposals. So that goes to this issue of having much more of a complex organizational structure where you're no longer just paying a core dev or moving a parameter up or down. It's like a very large number of interconnected and important parameters that are being coordinated by the proposal system, basically. We can also look at the forum side of things. So these are, again, for the council. We see basically anywhere from 100 to 200 on-chain forum posts every week that have to do with talking about different proposals for bounties and all the different things that are required to go live. And just, again, to repeat, this is a test net where I think every council is spending somewhere around $1,000 or so, which is a very small amount. So there's so little at stake. You can imagine if basically everything we've gotten right here with 2 or 3 orders of magnitude more economic substance behind it, you could see already that it's going to be a very different kind of DAO than most of the DAOs out there. So how are we making this work? So there's some familiar pieces to how our governance works, but I think actually diving into them will show that they're very different to how they work in other systems. So indeed, we have a coin vote on a periodic basis on a council, which works with a one person, one vote kind of system. So that's the same as in Polkadot, more or less. I think Polkadot has a rolling induction of council members. We have a periodic one, but that's not a big difference. Then I think our proposal system is very different. I've already alluded to this, where basically there are differentiated quorum requirements, threshold requirements for each individual action, which allows you to really fine-grained set the bar to the risk and urgency profile of each individual proposal. And the council has a budget out of which it's both delegating funds to working groups, which I'm going to describe next, and also spending and financing all sorts of expenditures in the system. You can contrast this to Polkadot, where I believe all the spending that's available for the council has to come out of very recent revenue or sort of slashing dynamics. Our budget is a pure minting budget, so it's not constrained by recent inflows of value, to put it that way, which allows you to have much more flexible financing. And then the working groups are these subcommittees that I'm going to get to, which are part of having a more hierarchical structure to actually deal with the different subsystems that get this DAO to, in sum total, actually provide a working and evolving video platform. So for the council, one of the most important things is to have it be a very visible political process to actually get entered. So it's this election system where people run, they have a candidacy and they're standing for something, and then people get to look at the history of everything a council member has done, and you could vote for them in an upcoming council, and you can reuse stake across the system for this purpose. And for the proposal system, what you can see is that, like the forum, it itself has a built-in discussion system, which is on-chain. So this, again, I believe on Polkadot, you use something like Polka Assembly again, where you have the deliberation in one place, and then you have the actual conclusion in another. We think it's really important to put those together, to have this ability to look back in history and see why things happen, what different people stood for, why they were agitating for it, what were the rationales, because it's fundamental to the ability to generate reliable information about the value of someone, for example, standing for election or wanting to enter one of these roles in these working groups. So we have a rich discussion system and a really rich view of the history of every proposal that's ever been passed in the system. Then we have the working groups, which I've sort of been skirting around this whole time. These are basically like bureaucratic subcommittees that are focused on specific parts of the system. So, for example, there's a bandwidth working group where individuals are concerned with providing bandwidth to the users who will consume the video and media content in the system. There's a storage system for long time archiving. There's a forum working group where you have the moderators basically working together. You have a content working group where you have the content curators that are responsible for managing the content metadata that lives in the system and making sure it's up to the policies of the DAO and so on. And I can go on. There are a bunch of these different working groups. And each working group really has two parts. It has one part sort of domain-specific business logic. So if you're in the forum working group, it means you have forum moderator privileges in certain subcategories of the on-chain forum, for example. Or if you're a content creator in the content creator working group, you can do certain curation actions. At the same time, there's a generalized sort of bureaucratic structure to each working group, which is very important to how this works. So each working group has a lead. The lead is elected by the council through the proposal system, through a hiring process, basically. The lead gets funding, basically, from the budget of the council into a working group budget, from which the lead can both set the salaries of the workers, which is another group role in each working group, and can spend discretionarily for all sorts of purposes. So all these activities, of course, the lead can hire workers, fire them, slash them. Likewise, the council can hire, fire, slash, and terminate leads. So there is this very clear hierarchy that I've been talking about in the way working groups relate to the council, and internally leads relate to workers. And and the budget again serves as sort of the overall budget constraint for each working group, which again is sort of credited from the budget of the council. So I think that gives a flavor for what we're doing. I guess I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.